should be recording now. And thank you everyone for joining this conversation, particularly Lee for being willing to sort of hop onto a meeting and talk Keycloak. I was intrigued by a bunch of the Zulip messages and questions that Lee was asking, and I thought, I bet there's some common interest in deploying open source authorization stack that can run next to a Fire server or protect the data in a Fire server. So that was pretty much the agenda I had in getting this group together, and hoping to learn from Lee what his team has been working on and just see what other questions folks have. So if it makes sense, let's just go around and do a quick round of introductions. It's a small enough group that I think that ought to work. I'm Josh Mandel. I'm the chief architect at Microsoft Healthcare and for the Smart Health IT project. And generally, if you find something you don't like in a smart spec, it's probably my fault, so I'm sorry. The curse of adoption and being named in the regulations is that suddenly people have to grapple in a very real way with all the warts and bumps. So my apologies in advance. I can turn over briefly because there's two other folks from my team at Microsoft who are here in the call. Maybe we'll just do that next so we can go as a group. Gino and Carl, if you want to just introduce yourselves briefly.
Sure. Again, my name is Gino Canessa. I work with Josh at Microsoft. Been working with Fire here for a couple of years and was in DICOM land before that. And have started really digging into all of the authorization and trying to find some of those words that all knocked out. That's fun. So.
And I'm Carl Anderson. I'm on Josh and Gino's team. I am just getting over knee surgery, so I'm convalescing on the couch. That's why my video is off. But I saw this meeting on Josh and Gino's calendar. I'm like, hey, what's that? That looks interesting. So I'm lurking.
Cool. And Lee, do you want to go next since you're sort of the nidus of this mix?
Oops, you're muted, Lee.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so my name's Lee. I'm a developer at IBM, kind of in and out of the Fire community for the last 5-6 years. But we have a open source Fire server that's Java based. So I work on that a lot. And then, various evangelism stuff, trying to get more people inside IBM to participate in the Fire community and drive it into our solutions and offerings and stuff. So I was saying kind of before everyone else joined that IBM's got, I think, 5 different authorization, web seal, ISAM, various products that could play here. But I was looking for an open source stack, to go with our open source server. And when IBM kind of bought Red Hat, and Red Hat has an investment in Keycloak, and Keycloak, they have a commercial version, Red Hat SSO. So it kind of was like a no-brainer for us to start looking there to see if it makes sense. And it took longer than I wanted to start that investigation. But finally this summer, I got that up and running, brought it to Connectathon in September, had reasonable success with it with a couple clients. And so I'm feeling pretty good about it. And that's why I agreed to talk, but I don't want to oversell my expertise here. I am neither a security expert nor a Keycloak expert. And so I'm hoping to learn from all you two.
Awesome. So we're just doing introductions for folks who are joining, and I'm going to go down the order of people that I have in teams, which is mostly alpha by first name, but then sometimes by last name. So it'll be Brian, and then after Brian, Dan, and after Dan, Ian, and then Dion, and then Venkat. And I'll repeat that again, but just so you've heard the order. Brian, if you don't mind just doing a quick intro.
Yep, so Brian Postlethwaite from Telstra Health down under in Australia. Mostly on the .NET stack, but we're also using Happy through the Smile Lib, or Smile App Library, whatever you want to call it. So I'm interested to see how that might squeeze into here. And with the open source Smart on Fire for desktop clients that I'm working through to try and help see if that actually might have anything that's of use. Cool.
So Brian, I think I missed it. So what was the thing? So you're using Happy with something, and that was another thing you were saying?
Smile CDR. So
Oh, it's fine. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
commercial.
Got it. Yep.
Yeah.
All right. I know. Yep. Thanks. I think I misheard it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome. Next up, Dan.
Sure. So my name is Dan Gottlieb. I think most of the people on the call know me. Know most of the people on the call. For those who don't, so I work on. I'm part of the Smart on Fire team at Boston Children's Hospital, and also work with the Department of Biomedical Informatics at Harvard Medical School on open standards. And so I've been involved in Smart for a long time. And in particular, I'm interested in Keycloak because increasingly people are asking me, what to use to implement Smart on Fire on top of their server. And I don't have a great answer now. As part of the Smart team, we wrote a reference implementation that fakes a lot of the back-end auth stuff, but that's obviously not super helpful for production. So I'm hoping to learn a little bit about kind of, Lee, what you've been doing and whether some of this might be a generalizable solution.
Perfect. And then next up, Ian.
So my name's Ian Balker. I work in the Biomedical Informatics Center at Brown University as a data scientist. But among other things that entails, I'm one of the maintainers of OpenMRS, which is an open source EHR that's primarily used in East Africa and other low middle income countries. And I'm actually the lead of the team that's implementing Fire there. And over the summer, I tried to mentor a GSOC project where we were going to update our Smart on Fire implementation, and that ran into all sorts of problems. So we finally landed on trying to implement it in Keycloak, and we got some hacky sort of things working, but it was pretty messy. So I'm interested if anyone has some good ideas about how to go about this, especially for the population I serve. Having something that's open source is, a necessity.
Yeah, that's a super important population that, honestly, we don't spend enough of our focus and energy on, but I'll say that's also an area that Microsoft is working to ramp up on. Next on my list, Dion.
Yeah, hi. Dion McMurtry, also from Australia. So I'm working at the Australian eHealth Research Centre, CSIRO, with Michael Lawley and Jim Steele, who you might know on Onto server. So I guess our interest, or me particularly from the team, around probably when lockdown started here, it was my lockdown project to get Keycloak working with Onto server, mainly because we had an authorization requirement for a big client who probably there'll be an announcement on Monday, and that'll be being used in sort of production sense. So we've spent sort of since, I don't know, whenever that was, March, working on getting that working. I guess similar to Ian, it's been a bit messy. So I was kind of hoping that I could find out some stuff that I don't know to make it a bit less messy. Keycloak brings a lot, but it also brings a bit of mess as well. And by no means am I an expert. I've just spent the last few months wrangling the thing. So yeah, I'd be really interested to find out more. I think we've sort of also had the benefit of really being able to operate within a constrained scope with the terminology server, Fire terminology server we're working with. So we don't have quite the same range of problem as a full Fire server would. But yeah, so we've got some experiences. I've actually made some extension customizations to Keycloak to work with for the clients that we're working with, and yeah, I'd love to figure out a better way around some of the things that I've bumped into.
Great. I'm impressed by how many folks have independently taken a real crack at this already. It's pretty encouraging just in terms of sharing notes. And the last on my list is Venkat.
Yeah, hi. This is Venkat Davaluri. I'm the medical director at Centene Corp, and I work with the innovation team. Centene is one of the pair MCO managed care organization in states. So I work with the innovation team over there, and we work with Microsoft and also work with the Happy Smile CDR team, and also like we are coming evaluating, I guess, with everybody and see what fits and what doesn't fit. And my interest in this meeting is to understand the security aspects and how we can implement and those kind of things. Uh, so I'm not an engineer and more of medical things, but I'm helping to give them the end user's perspective for the innovative team, and I'm here to learn about the Keycloak and how we can use that for the security and authorization authentication. Thank you.
Great. So having gone around the group, Lee, if you don't mind, I'll turn things over to you, and if you want to just sort of share with us a perspective on what you built, or if you've got things that you want to either tour or talk us through, I'm certainly all ears.
Oh, you are muted again.
I'm good at that. All right, so I haven't used Teams. Well, I think I have used it, but maybe not since updating my OS. And it won't let me share my screen unless I quit and rejoin, because Mac OS does that. So I have the decision of, should I talk without my screen for a while and then maybe leave and come back, or should I just get it over with and do it now? I'm thinking maybe just try to get it over with.
Yeah, I'd say go for it.
Restart it.
Yeah.
I'm already in my security and privacy settings, so I just have to say quit it and then join back. So let me make sure I have the meeting link here.
It's in Zulip if you don't.
Okay, perfect. I'll be right back. Sorry, guys.
No worries. See you right back. Funny, having to restart in between settings updates seems like such a little thing, but when you're in the middle of a meeting, not so much.
And it's only of course, it's only in the middle of a meeting when you discover you need to do that.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah, gotten to the point where it's easier to share via OBS than it is via screen share and all the different tools.
All right, let me try this now. Can you guys see it?
No.
Oh. It did ask me if I want to grant it some other permission for some other thing. Okay. Accessibility. It needs accessibility. Okay. I did that. That one didn't make it restart. Let me try one more time here. Any luck?
Yes.
There we
Yes.
go. That one's
Yes,
working.
that's the trick.
All right, and you'll have to forgive my mess. I'm just gonna share my whole screen, and I'll jump around a little bit. I didn't do a whole lot in terms of slides and prep, but I have a little bit.
This is great. Yeah.
Okay, so this is one of the use cases that we're interested in. So just to set the context, right? So this is the patient access API use case, from the CMS interop rules. Right, and so this is, I think, fairly standard. I just mentioned it because this is going to be a standalone app launch. I haven't done any work whatsoever with EHR app launch, so if y'all are interested in that, I'll have to have someone else present that piece of it. And so, we've got a member opening a third-party app. They're going to discover or pick their payer from a list. That's going to be a known endpoint somehow. I'm not going to deal with that part now. Right, they hit the discovery endpoints. They know the OAuth. They learn what the OAuth endpoints are. They get redirected to a login screen. They log in with their actual payer, third-party credentials. They come back to our auth server to grant consents. We kind of finish the dance, give them their access tokens, and they use those access tokens to request FHIR resources. So I blew by that because I'm assuming most of us are kind of at least familiar with the general flow there, but if there's more detail I need to cover just on the high level objective of that, let me know. So then I may attempt a demo, although we'll see how it goes. But I had a couple kind of things in addition to it that I just wanted to set the context for. So here's like your standard OAuth client types. You've got public clients and confidential clients. And not being an OAuth expert, I'm almost just stating this to kind of like tell you what I know, and then you guys can tell me what what I don't know maybe. But essentially, your traditional public client would be like a web application, or it would be like a mobile or native app that doesn't support dynamic client registration. And so there's just like, a client ID, and there's no secret. It's unable to keep a secret. And so in these cases, it's common to use the authorization code flow with proof key code exchange. With Keycloak, at least in my experience, you just kind of like get this for free out of the box. So when you register a client onto the system, you select the public option. It assigns you a client ID and no client secret, and then it automatically supports PKCE. Has been our experience.
And Lee, if I can ask just briefly on that one, does it support PKCE without requiring PKCE? Like, in other words, if the client doesn't feel like using a key?
Yeah, that's actually a question I have. So I don't have the answer for that one. I don't know if anyone else on the call does. I will pull up a Keycloak admin console here.
We've got implicit grant to work without the authorization code. So yeah, you can.
Yeah, so implicit grant is yet another way of getting a token, which of course we don't use in Smart, but it's a good indication that maybe there's a regular authorization code option where PKCE is up to the client to opt into.
So we run with implicit flow disabled.
Disabled,
and what I'm not positive of is that if you don't use PKCE, that it doesn't work. I haven't validated that piece of it, but I assume that's what this means is that, this is going to require you to use one of the supported flows. And for a public client, we would expect that to be PKCE. Let me jump back here. In terms of application onboarding, there's sort of the two ways to do it, right? There's manual or there's the DCR. Keycloak supports both of those, and we've done both of those. So if you're manually registering a client, you can just kind of come in and create a client and add the information. So Inferno is the one that I have here. But it also supports dynamic client registration at the realm level. So you can come in here and go to client registrations. And I think there's so many settings that it's hard to know them all. But at least what we found is if you want, it gives you pretty nice control over generating these initial registration tokens. And so this is what we used for Connectathon, as I kind of said, okay, this is good for 2 days, the length of the Connectathon, and we're going to allow up to 10 clients to register with this one key. And then we just shared this initial access token. And then I know at least 2 clients were able to use that initial access token to self-register based on discovering the endpoints that we were advertising. So that's that, and you have to copy it here because otherwise you can never get to it again. And then then you share it out, and you can kind of keep track of it, and you can revoke it and that sort of thing. So at least with the clients we've talked with, no one is thrilled with the idea of just letting anyone register their app anytime they want. And so this is something that we would be most likely taking advantage of to kind of control access to the DCR endpoints. But let me jump back to my my slide here because we'll have more on that. Okay, so that was just a little bit on the public client side. On the confidential client side, typically this would be like a client server where the server has secure backend storage. You know, all the usage of the app will go through those servers, and it has this client ID and a secret. It can be manually provisioned, or again, it could be dynamically onboarded. But in both of these cases, you have kind of like a single client ID and a client, you know, in the case of a confidential client, a single client secret for that application. And then I listed a couple questions here. I'm not sure if we should talk about them now or not, but like, I haven't played with like adjusting the, you know, like whether we give refresh tokens out and how long they're good for based on whether it's a public client or confidential client. So like that type of policy, I think Keycloak supports, but I just haven't set anything up like that yet. So I think it's okay to give a refresh token if you're using PKCE, but again, I'm not a security expert, so I don't know, Josh, if that's something you want to touch on. Is there advice on that one?
Yeah, well, sure. I could talk for way too long on this. So I'll just say my perspective is that, like, yeah, I wouldn't try to prevent certain apps just based on whether they're a public client, or grant other apps the ability just because they're a confidential client. This is playing out right now in ONC's EHR certification rules. And they keep sort of providing more clarifying examples. And even just last week, they published an update to their interim final rule to talk about native apps that are public clients and making sure they can get refresh tokens. But bottom line is, I would say, don't put a blanket restriction against public clients getting refresh tokens. There are times when that can be quite useful.
Yeah, I guess what I wonder is if it should be a shorter time frame, or do we think that PKCE really is secure enough that it's equivalent to having a confidential client?
Well, I would not try to make that equivalence for sure.
Yeah.
My perspective would actually be, even without PKCE, like there are perfectly good reasons to give a public client a refresh token. I think this is particularly relevant for patient-facing apps where it's like the user who wants to make a call, and it can be very frustrating if some policy gets in the way of me creating a long-term connection to my own healthcare data. So there are trust issues here, but it can be very hard to solve them for people without also just creating a wall. What I've seen in real life is that when you have policies like this, apps tend to do one of two things. Either they will basically just lie and register as a confidential client, even though they can't keep a secret, or they'll re-architect their app to route all their data through some cloud endpoint, even though the data doesn't need to be in the cloud at all. And both of those things can have a lot of negative consequences. So it's always a question of just sort of balancing these risks.
Okay, thanks, Josh. Yeah. Okay, so it brings me to the next slide, right? Which is like mobile or native apps, because I think this is like the kind of most interesting one, right? And so I put together the stupid flow diagram with my understanding of like what you should do, and then I'll get back to Keycloak in just a second. So if we're onboarding like a pure mobile app with no secure backend storage, there's sort of like two scenarios. One is it supports dynamic client registration, and the other one is it doesn't. So when it doesn't, then from what I've read, it should be treated like a public client. And so you probably onboard it, assign a client ID, they bake it into the app, and then, you know, all the instances of the app are using that single client ID, and it's fine because it's a public client and there's no shared secrets. There's just kind of like easy to spoof client IDs. Then, you know, if they do support dynamic client registration, it's like a way of kind of like saying, okay, now it's okay for them to be treated as confidential clients because they can, each instance of the application can register itself and have its own secret. It doesn't have to be kind of like baked into the application. And therefore you end up with, you know, a whole bunch of client IDs and client secrets that were dynamically registered, possibly all using one or a set of initial registration tokens. And now these ones are treated just like confidential clients. So there's like so much out there on OAuth and OpenID. This is like my super simplified version of like what would we use in practice. Does it seem right?
I think
Not
both
right.
of these arms have merit, but there are also other arms that could have merit in some circumstances.
Yeah. Okay. So I mostly am sharing that because this is like where my head is at as I learn these things, right? As I have these questions, and then I'm trying to figure out what does this map to in Keycloak. And so I did show kind of that dynamic client registration piece and how you can get an initial access token, and you start going down this arm, right? And then in terms of the benefit of doing that, I think it would just be a, case by case, depending on whatever client we're talking with and how secure they need it to be and their opinions on public clients, which I think, yeah. Okay, so I'm not going to go through this whole flow diagram. This is, I might go through this in a second, but this is like how we're doing Smart App Launch with Keycloak. It's very similar to what you see in the diagrams directly in the app launch, Smart App Launch spec. And hopefully I have all the details right. One nice thing with like Keycloak is it's like I got it working really fast, but then like to actually document what it's all doing is harder because you have to be like, oh, like is that a redirect or is it just like secretly doing some work? And so the interesting pieces for us here are we're kind of always counting on having an external identity provider. Keycloak can be that identity provider itself, but we're thinking it's going to be more of a broker of identity. And so we're using Keycloak's broker capabilities and federation capabilities. So so we've got this OpenID provider. And then the other kind of interesting piece here is we've got this token response rewriter. And this is really just for one thing. And it's really, the way I have it is only involved in one path, and that's the token path. So when you get a token, this is the thing that we're currently using to take something out of the token, which is supposed to be opaque to the client, and put it into the response. And so I'll get into that in just a second. Okay, so again, mostly standard OAuth here. The interesting bit starts here. I'm guessing no one can see this because it's so small. Let me see if I can just.
I can see it, but I have to make it as large as I can make it before I can see it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, and I can't zoom in. Okay, so about here is where it gets interesting. So, well, I mean, the scopes are are unique to Smart. Well, OpenID isn't, but the launch patient and patient, these patterns are unique to Smart. I'd imagine anyone doing Smart with Keycloak has figured out that piece of it, right? So there's a set of client scopes. Again, it's per realm. And so here I'm in the test realm, and we've got a script that adds these things. So we actually use the Java API to do it. There's also a command line interface for kind of programmatically configuring it, or you can come in here and click like a billion times to do it. So, which is what I did initially. I did it, and then finally, after your 10th one, you realize it's time to automate it. So, okay, so client scopes, and there's also a kind of default client scopes. So this is going to affect the scopes that are kind of like enabled by default for a brand new client that you either just manually created or that has been dynamically registered. And again, this is where that dynamically registered thing comes in, is I can say like, please, for every dynamically registered client that comes in, give them this config. And then in the client list here, their client scopes would like kind of have inherited. So that would be the default. And they are allowed to kind of override that I haven't really spent any time trying to do that. And so instead, basically what I do is I set up the default client scopes. So first I set up the default client scopes, and then automatically my clients always get these. I'm always handing out the launch patient scope. This was a learning from Connectathon. We didn't used to do this, but some of the clients don't request it, but they kind of were assuming that we were doing it anyways. And so now I just always assign it. All the other ones you have to ask for. This would be harder to do if you're supporting more use cases, but again, we're kind of focused on this one right now, and launch patient is what is prescribed, so we're good. There's other other launch contexts and stuff too, obviously. This gets us to mappings. So well, let me jump back to the diagram. Okay, so we're here at the auth code and client ID and secret. They've already asked, specify which scopes they want. They've already logged in. And at this point, Keycloak is acting as a broker to the identity provider. And it has some capabilities where either the very first time a user logs in, it'll create a user profile for them, or every time they log in, it'll overwrite whatever was there, or there's some other options too. So we're using every single time they log in, rewrite their profile with anything we got from the identity provider. So that's kind of the flavor of this that we're using. And on top of that, we are expecting this identity provider to give us a claim that has a user identifier in it, which either matches or can be mapped to the resource ID. And so this is like the glue that holds it all together. And so there's kind of a big assumption, because like no one has this yet unless they've already implemented smart. Like they have IDs, but they have like a lot of different IDs, and then trying to make sure that this ID matches whatever Fire resource ID is something that we'll have to work with them on. We have a services team, etc., that will do this type of work. So we'll see how this plays out as we get into it. But we're just kind of looking for what is the claim that we should be looking for to use as the resource ID, or again, as something we can map to the resource ID. So that is becoming a property of the user. And so here I've got a single user. Sorry, not a property, an attribute of the user. And so here it's the exact resource ID that we want. And so I've named this resource ID, and it has a value of patient 00000. Okay. So this attribute, again, is part of the identity provider config. Well, I don't have it here, but it would be. And again, it's kind of going to get rewritten with whatever we're getting from the identity provider every time. And that gives it the user. Now, getting that into the actual access token, which is what we need for the next piece of, okay, sorry. Now there's a consent step. So this happens one time. Keycloak tracks consents. And so at the user level, you can view the consents. So this user has granted the Inferno client these scopes and this additional grant at this time, and you can revoke it. So that's the consent piece. Because it's remembered here, it's not going to represent that each time. It's just the very first time. Okay, now we get to where we're going to actually, so the client has granted this, granted the consent. This application can access their data on their behalf, and now they are they want to get back the access token. And with our approach, we want to have enough information in that we're using JWTs, and our approach is to have enough information in that JWT to make the authorization policy decision based on the JWT without doing an extra hop. This is going to be obviously subject to change like everything else, but at least initially this is the goal. And so we're including the patient ID in the right in the token, in the JWT token, and that's done via a mapper. And so here in the client scope remember we always give launch patient. Launch patient has two mappers. It's got a patient ID mapper, which is going to take the resource ID user attribute and map it into a claim called patient ID. And then separately, we have a group membership mapper. This is, I guess, more internal detail. This is less interesting, I think, for others. But we're assigning the users to some group, and then we're making some additional policy decisions based on the groups they're in. So that's mapping or mappers. So that's the thing that's getting us from this user identifier and this ID token that became a attribute of the patient that then gets mapped into this patient ID. And then on the way back, we're intercepting it. We're looking in the JWT, because JWTs are not encrypted. They are encoded. And so you can just unencode it and look at the data. And so we're unencoding it, looking at it, pulling out this patient ID and adding it to an attribute called patient that's in the token response. So the reason we do that is because this is what's recommended from the Smart App launch, so that you can treat the token itself as opaque. Clients shouldn't assume that there's like a special claim inside of this token that they can use to get the context. So they are instead going to be looking here. They use this to make appropriate queries to the server. The server is validating the tokens. It uses we use Webster Liberty or Open Liberty, which is like a Java app server. And so this is actually, way up here. It's actually pulling the JW keys, the JSON web key set from the OAuth server. And then it's using those keys to validate that these access tokens that come in are correct. It's making an authorization policy decision, which is actually like one of the most interesting pieces, but I'm not going to belabor too much. We use something similar to, I think, an idea that I heard kicked around in the community in the past, where it's kind of like building on the compartments. So like there's the patient compartment, and resources belong to the patient compartment or don't. And we use that as part of the policy decision here, along with the patient scope, the scopes that were passed and the patient context that was passed. And then if they have access to the request, if the request is good and they have access to the resources, then we'll return it to them. Okay, so it's like a lot of stuff. I probably talked too long. Was that interesting? Is that good? Like, where do we want to go from here? I covered one of the mappers, which was the that patient ID mapper. I also have mappers on all of these claims, which is an audience mapper. And because we only have this server that's like tightly coupled to our server, like it's not an auth server for anyone other than our resource server. And so we just always hard code the audience to match our server. So no matter what is requested on the way in, you're going to get this audience on the way back out, and then that gets checked on our server to make sure that the token that was granted, the access token, has the proper audience for our server. I think that's the only other mapper we have. Okay, let me stop there. Questions, comments? Was this too basic?
I thought this was great. Super useful orientation for me. I've got some questions, but I don't want to monopolize the question time, so I'll go last.
Hey, hi, I joined a little late. This is Sagar. Can I raise one question?
Yeah, of course.
I'm curious on the token response rewriter. Is that what it is? The component between client app and auth server?
Yep.
So is it something that is written on top of Keycloak server as an extension, or is it an external component?
So we deploy in Kubernetes, and it's actually like a little Nginx pod that just fronts it. So that's how we're doing it right now. But it's not in Keycloak. So I think you could easily, well, I don't know how easily, but it sounds like maybe some folks on the call have done this. You could do this piece by writing a plugin to Keycloak. And actually, my colleague wanted to do that, and I kind of liked having it outside of Keycloak because it makes Keycloak easier to replace. So like in our offering, we can replace this with a different OAuth server because not everything just lets you kind of like plug in something that rewrites the, authorizing flow logic. And so I like it being external. It so far has worked for us, but it's not the only way to do it. You could write a plugin to Keycloak, and there is a plugin for Keycloak that does this. I just haven't used it.
Okay. That makes sense.
I've actually got a PR open with Keycloak right now to add the capability to add claims to the access token response. So, assuming that gets merged in at some point, that should be a capability built into Keycloak.
Yeah, and then we can remove our response rewriter.
Yeah.
Yep, that would be great. Nice, good. That's the beauty of not being the only one on a stack, that's working on this stuff. Yeah. So we can all benefit from each other. That sounds great. Yeah. Okay. I want, if there's not any other questions, I'll let Josh ask his, but I also have questions for you all. So
I'll just ask one then.
Right.
It has to do with the audience property. And I wanted to check whether I understood right. So in the smart flow, there's an audience parameter that's passed into the initial authorization request. And I'm curious whether you pay attention to that today and validate that value on an incoming request.
So
if you search this for AUD equals.
Yeah. Yep. This one.
That's the incoming parameter.
Yep. Yeah. So we ignore that.
Okay. There is a security issue there to think about.
Well, so okay. So to be clear, what we do is on the authorization server side, we ignore the requested audience, and we write the one that matches our server. Our resource server checks the audience to make sure it matches. Okay, now you can tell me what the security issue there or consideration is.
Yeah, the consideration is, I'll send a link to it, but it's an attack where a fake Fire resource server points to your real authorization server as its authorization server, and sends the client to your real authorization server to go get a token, which your client then dutifully does, and then tells it to the fake resource server. I'll send you a link to a write-up on this. That's sort of why that parameter exists.
Okay. One thing I did notice is that Keycloak they had some support for passing in an audience, but they used like a fully specified audience parameter versus an odd. And don't quote me on that because that was a while ago. That was before I decided to hard code it. So has anyone had experience with setting or passing the audience parameter in?
Only so far as we do exactly what you do, probably for the same reasons. Yeah, same experience.
Yeah, I think Inferno passes this, and I was trying to make Keycloak use it, and then I was doing some like ugly thing where I was like rewriting the parameter name to match what Keycloak was expecting, and it wasn't working well, and it didn't make sense because it's always our server, so I just set it to our server's URL.
Yeah, no, I went through. It sounds like a very similar experience.
Yeah. Okay.
I've actually been validating the audience, the AUD parameter, but that's because I've got a whole authenticator flow that I built to do the actual smart pieces of the authentication. And it was just easy to check, does this URL match something that we're expecting? Especially because I'm developing something that could be used for multiple endpoints, so I don't really have the luxury of being able to hard code.
Yeah. Josh, my initial take is of if this is a security issue, which it sounds like it could be, I would probably just validate that the odd that passed in matches what we're expecting it to be on the way in before it gets to Keycloak, like in my response rewriter proxy perhaps, or we try to patch Keycloak. I think those are two reasonable options there.
Cool, and that reminded me to ask the Inferno team whether that's something Inferno actually checks for, because it would be possible for Inferno to make sure that servers fail when they should fail.
So if you had two different resource servers, that's two different audiences, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you have from the same setup different scopes for the two different resource servers? Or is that not something that happens?
I think it depends on how you have things set up. So in my flow, I actually have the resource server set up as a client as well, because we do some mutual authentication stuff with the Keycloak server, and using that setup, we can kind of control using the the configuration screens that were shown before. You can kind of control that.
Okay.
Yeah, we
using identity server, we were having some dramas getting that set up. And I was curious whether the same dramas were likely to be here. But
yeah, we do a similar thing in that, kind of for our realm, we've got a couple of Onto server and another server endpoints kind of together as a deployed sort of stack. And so each one of those is a client, and they've got different client scopes because they're you need to configure the rights to those different endpoints differently. So that's sort of how we've handled that.
So it can be done, I guess, is the point.
Yeah, it can. Cool. One of the issues we've sort of had is, I mean, it's kind of good because we've sort of got this idea of scopes that are applicable to a particular endpoint, and then these sort of more global sort of permissions that intersect with those that you can define kind of at a realm level. So it's kind of good that you've got those two levels, so you can say, well, here's this scope for the realm, and then here's this scope for the client, and you can intersect that stuff. But the client scopes thing, as you pointed out before, the having to sort of statically configure all of that stuff, even with automation, is a pain. We had this kind of need to express this different sort of scopes that people could have based on a kind of a dynamic configuration, and ended up being what groups they're in, and but being able to advertise that these particular scopes exist through the OIDC well-known meant that they needed to be in that big long list, which meant we had to write a plugin to be able to manage that, which is a bit of a pain. But yeah, I'm not really sure that there's much option other than that.
It did remind me that we did write a plugin as well, but ours is like the world's simplest plugin. So our resource ID, we wanted to keep it just the ID and no prefix of like capital P patient /. But there's a fire user claim, which I forgot to talk about. So the fire user claim, fire user scope, I should say, it lets the client use that in introspection, and it gets back a claim that's like the fire user ID. But Inferno was expecting that to be including the capital P patient /, whereas our resource ID didn't. And so what we wrote is a plugin that's just a mapper that prefixes the patient / to it. That's it. it was like it was actually kind of perfect for us as a like you know, hello world type plugin. It just concatenates 2 strings and returns it. I have another question. Oh, go ahead, Josh.
A quick question on that, because the Fire user claim appears in the ID token, which is a signed token. So how do you manage to update the value in the signed token downstream of where it's generated?
We do it in Keycloak. That's the plugin. That's why we have to do it as a plugin.
Plugin versus proxy.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. So the proxy is where we were pulling something out of the token and putting it in the token response.
Yep.
All right. I have another question, and this is like the thing that I'm racking my brain on, which is like the smart context picking. So you have one user, they have access to multiple, you know. So this is the thing, like there's so much Zulip discussion, but I still don't understand how I'm supposed to do it. And I was looking at IGEA Keycloak because they have a little like smart context picker, but I can't get it to work. And it sounds like Ian, you might have this.
I've got a patient selector, but it's based on that's one of the pieces that's really hacky. It kind of redirects into the EMR into our already existing patient search thing, and then we you know, because we already kind of have that, and then you search and it sends this message back to it sends a token back to Keycloak that said this person picked this patient, and then we include that in the final response. That's where we had to write a really messy Keycloak plugin to get that flow to work.
Did you look at the IGEA one at all? Because that one is also I think that's very similar.
Yeah, actually, our setup is very similar to so the initial reason I went with Keycloak is I found the IGEA stuff, and I just thought, oh hey, this will be easy. We just take that stuff and get it to work. And I had such a hard time getting any of the IGEA stuff to actually run.
All right, I'm not alone then. Yeah,
no.
it hasn't been touched in like 16 months or 10 months, so it's like not real promising. I did open an issue on their GitHub, but I'm thinking I need to just figure out my own thing at this point. So
I mean, I can point you to the repo where we have but it's what we have is not good.
Yeah, I know that feeling. Yep. I at least wrote up like what I think the flows are on it, and so that's what I just started sharing here. I don't know what time. I think we're supposed to be done, so we probably can't go over this now. But like this is what I'm going to be looking at next, because I gotta figure it out how to do this with Keycloak, and at least there's precedent, so I know it's doable.
But yeah. This flow diagram you have though is actually really nice.
Thanks. I did this today because I'm like, oh crap, how am I going to talk about this? Because I don't have anything to show for this one. Actually, I could have shown that other stuff working, but this one I don't have anything to show except here's how I think it would work, but I don't know. So I was thinking. So the difference is here, my proxy token thing has turned into a smart context picker thing, and now instead of assuming that we are going to get a claim from the identity provider that has a resource ID in it or something that can map to be a resource ID, we're going to assume that we're going to get a set of resource IDs that the user has access to. I think that's, again, like a kind of ridiculous assumption, but that's my assumption because it's what makes it work. Then we do the consent thing like normal, and then we return that set of resource IDs in the token. So our patient ID becomes like a patient IDs. So like this one becomes patient IDs. Then we're gonna, kind of grab that on the way back out. We're gonna use that within the little web app to retrieve the information for those patients, present them as like a context picker form. User picks which patient they're launching in the context of, and then we return the access ID and refresh, and the access token has the patient ID. Or I actually don't even think it has to have that. It just the token stays the same as what Keycloak wrote because we can't overwrite it. But the only thing the context picker is doing is they'll know because they picked, patient. They'll know the current of patient is patient Bob, and they'll have the patient ID.
So our setup does do something a little bit similar, but it's like we have a secondary flow behind. Once the user consents, we redirect them still in the Keycloak session. We redirect them and then the reason we have that set up that way is that I also wanted to be not have to communicate back to the authorization server in case the user, in case the app does the bad thing and tries to access a resource it shouldn't be using because of the context for whatever reason. It's just easy if it's easy if that information's also in the signed token. But I'm not sure if that's that much of an issue.
Yeah. What would be interesting is to see how it seems like basically everything in this box you're just doing within Keycloak, and other than that, it's very similar.
Yeah. Well, we're doing behind Keycloak, so it's still communicating with a separate web app, but it's still part of the Keycloak flow rather than something we're sticking on the end.
Yeah. Okay. I think it really is important to get that step captured, even if it's something as loosely coupled as a UX redirect, to have that happen sort of before the user is done giving consent, because that context is sort of part of what they're consenting to.
Yeah, I struggled with that one because you're showing a list of patient names to the app, right?
No.
Well, to the end user because it's in a secure context. Okay, I'm with you. Yeah. So then, yes, this piece should move below that other piece. Yep.
Yeah.
I'm with you there. Actually did it that way initially, and then I convinced myself to change it.
It was nice having it down there because you already had a piece down there.
Yeah.
It swapped out very cleanly.
Yeah.
So practically, I'm wondering if there's appetite to to work on just a cookbook or a shared guide or something to capture some of this for Keycloak for Smart on Fire, because it sounds like we've all independently kind of learned a bunch of stuff, and I don't know about you guys, but I found like it sucked, and I would have loved to have had something that pointed me how to do that. I mean, part of it maybe, like you say, is I'm far from a security guy, but I found Keycloak's terminology very confusing. The way it kind of used the term client in multiple senses, and scope and client scope. It also uses it in multiple senses, and it was it was a painful journey. So I don't know if there's the ability or appetite to do something like that, but that might help other people who might come along and want to do this as well.
Yeah, I think I'd be interested in contributing to something. I don't know what that thing is, but I did at least attempt to message the Keycloak community. So there's a Keycloak community, but I haven't found a way to contact them or get them to pay attention other than opening Red Hat support tickets, which is not what I want to be doing because then no one can benefit from it but me.
I found a discourse.
I posted on it and got no response. Did you?
Yeah, I posted on it because I had some problems at the time, and I got no response. But eventually, I found somebody else who had the same problem, and I eventually figured it out and posted back to them, and they were thankful. But you know, there was, yeah, it wasn't particularly useful.
Yeah, no, that's been one hard thing working with Keycloak is I just can't figure out how to get in touch with anybody.
Yeah.
So maybe at least if we springboard from this meeting, right, and you know, we become our own support for our own stuff. You know, if we all keep working on it, it's just a matter of where do we want to converse. And I think probably the fire channel is a better option than the Keycloak one. But the nice thing of having it on the Keycloak one is, like, I think if we show that we're a sizable group doing work that matters, that the Keycloak developers will engage, right? Whereas it seems like a one-off thing if they just hear from you over here on Discourse and me over here on Zulip. But maybe if we converse on their channel, you know, it might help. I don't really know. I just thought it was cool that they use Zulip because my Zulip was really lonely. I only had fire, and now I have Keycloak.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, and I mean, if we can collect some of the kind of ways that the common ways we configure stuff, so that other people find it a bit easier, and then maybe even if there's multiple patterns to do some of the other things like we've discovered, then at least people might have a bit of a cookbook, even if it isn't really, you know, really thorough documentation, just the ideas that exist, you know, how to approach certain problems. Might be useful. I certainly would have helped me 6-9 months ago.
Yep.
I'm definitely up for contributing to something like that because there's a lot of documentation I wish it existed.
The thing that was maddening for me is that IGEA thing, because it's like it looks like they solved it all. Like they solved all the problems, right?
Yeah,
but then like, so it's like it's right there, and it's open source, but it's hard to grok. You know, it's hard to figure out how they're doing what they're doing, and you can't get it to run, so it doesn't help you too much. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. No.
I should be more careful with the words I choose on a recorded WebEx, but yeah, I mean, it's really good work, right? It's cool that they did that. I wish they kept with it, and you know, maybe we could all be using it or contributing to it.
Yeah.
All right, Josh, you want to do a closing?
Josh actually had to drop here a few minutes ago, so he didn't want to end the discussion, but he had a hard stop. So yeah, I think definitely this was very informative for everyone, and I think there's some low-hanging fruit to be had as far as consolidating knowledge and then finding all of our overlaps and putting something together to make this far less painful in the future. So we'll sync up after and figure out what good next steps would be to kind of promote that and make that doable and give it a home and everything else. So yeah, I think
awesome.
Beyond that, thank all of you so much, Lee especially. That's
thanks, Lee.
A great knowledge dump. And everyone else, that was a great discussion and getting all of the implementation experience that everyone has. So we'll post the recording once it's all done, and thanks again.
Yeah, thanks, Gino. And tell Josh we say thanks when you run into him, or we'll tell him on the channel.
Yes, and he'll see it in the recorded video. So perfect.
Oh, sorry. All right. Have a good weekend, y'all.
Thanks, Sam. Cheers.
Great information.
Bye.